Get started. I know people are still kind of trickling in, which is good. But we'll go ahead and kick things off here because I'm worried already that we're not going to be able to make it through what I want to make it through today. So we'll see. Just a quick recap. I feel like we gained a lot of momentum last week. Really appreciate all the comments. Had some really phenomenal comments after talking about the parable of the weeds. And the wicked and the righteous, and multiple people had comments associating the fact that we often tend to see ourselves as the weed pullers, and that is not our job. That's not our responsibility. So definitely appreciate those comments. It's an awesome thought as we're living in the world and we're kind of coexisting with the wicked and the righteous. It's important to recognize, but it's important also not to take on the responsibility of us deciding to be the weed pullers. God designates the weed pullers at the end, right? During the harvest, and that's not our responsibility. So definitely appreciated those comments. Last week we kind of presented and looked at this idea of Jesus' teaching style with the parables being fairly ad hoc, kind of being a response or reaction to things that were going on around him. We talked about him doing that in this honor-shame culture when we looked at the parable of the banquet. And we saw, if you remember, we saw Jesus kind of noticing at the Pharisees' house when they were at the Sabbath dinner, we saw him noticing that people were kind of determining social rank and kind of had this pecking order thing going on, determining where they were going to sit at this Pharisee's house. And he saw that, and then he kind of went into his parable based upon that when he started talking about the great banquet. And we framed up this idea that everyone's invited, right? It's not what the Pharisees or the Jewish people might have think. We talked about the idea of that one individual at the Sabbath meal said, how great to eat, how great to eat with other Jewish men. This is what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. Is like this group, right? This room of Jewish men who have like kind of navigated their social pecking order, right? And Jesus says, well, actually not at all. It's not going to be like that at all. And he goes into this parable of the banquet and who's invited. It turns out everyone's invited, right? You don't even need an invitation. You just got to show up. They go through, he tears down, we talked about paradigm shifts, right? And how do you kind of force a paradigm shift onto someone? And the way you do that is you kind of make your way into the back door. You got to kind of convince them something, get level playing field. You don't just come right up to them, right, and say, hey, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong, because then they're not going to be receptive to that, right? And we talked about this kind of idea of going in the back door, and we see Jesus do that all the time with his parables. And he tears down the social ranks again, and he goes from the Pharisees and the social elites that were invited to this party, right? And then he goes to the lame people and the crippled, and he invites them. And then he goes beyond that, and he leaves the town, and he goes to the highways and says, everyone's invited. Which is really Jesus kind of showing the Pharisees that, hey, this idea that you have for what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like, that it's going to be representative of what's going on in this room, in this Sabbath meal, not at all. On the contrary, it's the people out there. It's a different type of, it's a tearing down, right, of this societal structure and the tribalism and the things that we talked about. And we looked at the parable of the weeds again, right, and the idea of the wicked and the righteous will coexist. And one thing right there that we kind of touched on earlier in the class too was just remember how to them they're thinking like Isaiah 6 or Malachi 4, and they're thinking like God is going to come and it's going to be noticeable, right? It's going to be this new kingdom of heaven when it's realized on earth, it's going to be noticeable. And so for them, this idea of the wicked and the righteous coexisting for an indeterminate amount of time is a little uncomfortable, right? It's kind of counterintuitive to what they were thinking was going to happen when the kingdom of God came. They were expecting, might and power, and all the other nations would recognize God, the God of Israel. But really, it's a little different, Jesus kind of suggests, and he talks about how through this coexisting, he's trying to implement a new heart, right? A new way of thinking about the kingdom of heaven And so I want to recap over the course and kind of where we are now, some of the main themes that we've, throughout this class, have drawn out of the parables. The first one is that the kingdom of God that Jesus is bringing is the true fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures, right? So we saw Jesus, many parallels with Hebrew Scriptures from the prophets and how influenced we saw him being when he gave these parables, right? We see those themes of seeds and growth in Israel, or in Isaiah, that's a main theme in Isaiah, and then we see Jesus repeating that in his day, not just to prove that he understood the Scriptures, but also because it related with the listeners. And then the second theme that we kind of started to talk about was that Jesus is bringing a new value system that's incompatible with the system currently held by his listeners. I think we first started to kind of broach this subject when we talked about the Good Samaritan and how the lawyer kind of had a presupposed idea of, surely not everyone is worthy of my generous love, right? Surely not someone like a Samaritan. And Jesus gives this parable of the Good Samaritan and essentially puts it back on the lawyer and says, who should you be in this story, in this parable? And he can't even say it, but he said, the one that helped, right? But you should be like this Samaritan, he's saying. And that's Jesus kind of starting to show throughout his teaching that he's tearing down this societal, the tribalism, the racism, right, that is currently held by the religious leaders, and he's replacing it with something new. And we've been seeing that. We saw that last week, kind of this idea of what he might be replacing it with. But we're going to kind of shift gears throughout the course of the class now and talk about this third point, which is that the parables that Jesus presents to people, specifically the Pharisees and the societal scum in the Pharisees' minds, the crippled, the lame, it brings on a crisis of decision. So when you hear these parables, it's not, we talked earlier on, right, how they might linger with you for a while and you can think on them. And that's true, and you can think on them for a long time, but eventually you're going to reach a point throughout these parables where you have to make a decision. How are you going to respond to what Jesus is proposing through these parables? Are you going to be like the Pharisees and eventually seek him out and kill him? Or are you going to be like the Moshas of the world that start to kind of connect the dots, and as they go home, they talk about it with their families and their kids as they read the prophets. They're starting to see these dots and saying, hey, maybe this Jesus is onto something. All these new these parties that Jesus is having, when you compare and contrast with the Sabbath meal that we talked about last week, Jesus is creating these new kind of parties, right, with the tax collectors and the sinners, and they're getting together and they're having dinners, and Jesus is even kind of throwing away some of what the society would hold on to in terms of families, right, and saying, my mother's not my mother, my brothers aren't my brothers, but these tax collectors, these sinners, these people that I'm associating with, they're my brothers. And he essentially goes through this kind of transition to where he says, this is the party that I'm talking about at the great banquet, right? It's not this Sabbath meal, but it's these parties that we're having with these sinners and these tax collectors. Oh, I just talked through all this, didn't I? I think I didn't keep up with my slides. And in the idea of the fulfillment of the Scriptures, too, we also talked about Isaiah's commission, right? And how Jesus kind of echoed that. And he knew that there would be people who didn't have ears to hear, right? He would go out and he would tell these things, and he knew that there would be people that didn't listen. The new value system, sorry, I kind of got into it there. So this new value system that we talked about, what is the new value system that Jesus is proposing? It's not like we looked at last week. It's not a bunch of Jewish men sitting around a table based upon social rank, right? It's more reminiscent of the parable Art talked about when the prostitute kind of bursts into the room and starts washing Jesus' feet. And that type of interaction in an honor-shame culture put a lot of shame in people's minds on Jesus, that he would even associate or even allow this to happen. But again, we see Jesus kind of twisting the value system and laying something new out for the Pharisees. This new value system, it was incompatible with the social ranks, right? It undermines them, and it brings out this idea of grace and forgiveness. And I want to talk about this type of forgiveness where the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day, they viewed this forgiveness as like vertical, right? It's going up and down between you and God. But over time, they took that and said, hey, well, my forgiveness that goes up and down between me and God is better than your horizontal forgiveness that goes up and down between you and God. And this idea that they, throughout society kind of continued to breed this culture where the vertical plane changed to be this horizontal structure of how they viewed forgiveness of themselves. It was no longer between them and God. It wasn't the righteous and the wicked coexisting. It was them kind of determining and laying out who was in and who was out. They kind of started to propose, there's this boundary line. And when you look at the Sabbath meal that we talked about last week, those men were in, right? They were in the boundary line. But when Jesus proposed the invitation going out to the crippled and to the lame, to them, they were outside this boundary line. They didn't fall within the boundary of forgiveness of that day. So ultimately, we see that when God forgives, or when God invites someone to the party, he levels the playing field. There's no grid anymore. There's no horizontal line as to who's in and who's out. There's no boundary line. Everyone's invited to the party. All you have to do is show up. And what I want to get to here, and what I want to talk about, is this idea of forgiveness and this fundamental new human heart that Jesus is bringing through the arrival of the kingdom of heaven. That's one of the ways that we as people, it's a decision, and it's an active thing that we have to do in order to imitate the coming of the kingdom of God. And that's what Jesus proposes too, right? We see in the Lord's Prayer, we see Jesus say, oh, forgive us as we forgive our debtors or those who have sinned against us. But it's this idea that they're tied together. You can't have one without the other, right? And that act of forgiveness is an immediate response. It's not something that you think about back in the vertical plane, but it's forgiveness that in order for us to receive that vertical plane forgiveness, we have to remove that boundary line, right? And we have to remove this concept of horizontal forgiveness in which we are in control of, or in which we judge people based upon whether they're in or they're out. And that's one of the decisions that Jesus really asks of his listeners as he goes through these parables. So, we have this idea of this radical invitation, right? When you tear down the boundary and there is no boundary, that invitation seems a lot more radical. There's no limits on it. When you don't have these lines of who's in and who's out, and it's no longer this, hey, I'm a Pharisee, so I'm in, then it kind of, from a Pharisee's perspective, to them, I think it almost belittles the gift a little bit, right? They hold on so tightly to this racism and tribalism and the fact that they're in, right? So today, we're going to take a look. I've talked for a long time, so feel free. Any comments? This is a discussion class. Sorry about that. But go ahead and open up to Luke 15. Any comments so far? Yeah, Larry. I do have a mic, sorry. Sorry about that, Dave. I've got one and Dave's got one.
In some ways, certainly the value system Jesus was proposing was new to the Pharisaical society, something they hadn't thought of. But I think back to the book of Jonah, where God's values always had been one of mercy and forgiveness and the acceptance of all. And I think the book of Jonah and the reaching out to Nineveh is an example of that.
Absolutely. Great point. I mean, this is not a fundamentally new idea to the character of God. This is something that God has always wanted. We saw that with Jonah. And in many ways, Jonah was like a Pharisee at the end. He got under the tree. He was mad. And this idea of, why are you so mad? That he's gracious? Another good parallel would be the workers in the vineyard. And they work, a full day's work, and they're working, and then every hour he adds more people, and then an hour later he adds more people, and then at the end of the day there's people who maybe only worked 30 minutes, but they all get paid the same. And the people who've been there all day, they're mad. Why are they mad? You don't have to get a mic for this one, just shout it out. They're mad because the master's generous. And they're saying, oh, no, I don't want you to be generous. I want you to pay us based upon what's fair, what we did. It's the same idea, and absolutely, God, that's not a fundamentally new idea to the character of God. That's something that God has always wanted for his people. We saw with like the vineyard manager, right? That he built up this perfect vineyard, and he put this tower there, right? The point is, the Israelites didn't respond. And the point here is the Pharisees didn't respond. They didn't do what Jesus intended with what he had given them. And it's a theme that we see, honestly, throughout the entire Israelite nation's history. And we see it repeated here throughout the New Testament in the Pharisees. That's a great point. I love bringing Jonah into this. We're going to read Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 24. And I'm just going to... Oh, yeah, was there another comment? Yeah, Steve. Here, I got you.
Thanks, brother. As I think about the Pharisees and people's attitudes and how they become better, think they're better, I think there's a warning to us all or to pay attention that we don't become puffed up or think that just because, well, I go to church, I attend studies, I have my own personal time, that somehow that elevates us or makes us better.
Yeah.
When it really doesn't. It should make us more humble.
Absolutely. That's a great point. That's a great point. It should make us more humble, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes, right, of the Pharisees. And we don't want to bring back this idea of a horizontal plane of forgiveness where you're in or you're out, because it's not up to us, right? We're not the weed pullers. We bring them in, and just because I go to church every day and I read my Bible, and then maybe someone just came in off the streets and they've been coming for 2 weeks, and then we say, oh, well, they're not invited to the party yet, right? They're still working on it. That's not up to us. The point is to get them in the door. The point is to bring them to the party and let God do his work. Obviously, I'm saying that we are the vessels in which God does do his work to help them come to Jesus. But the point is to not rebuild that boundary line that Jesus literally gave his life for to tear down. So let's look. Any other comments before we dive into Luke 15? All right. Luke 15, starting in verse 11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. I'm going to pause. So right before this, we're not going to read through them, but there's 2 parables right before this. The parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. And then Jesus goes into this parable of the 2 sons. And what is interesting, as we read through this, think back to those 2 prior parables and think about how the plot lines are fairly parallel, but Jesus does a new spin with this parable. And it's interesting to note that we're in the section of Luke in like the travel section where Jesus is just teaching like crazy, and all these parables are just kind of thrown in here. But Luke very intentionally, from the way he wrote this, put this almost in a rhetorical scene so that these 3 parables are right next to each other and they all play off of each other. So, Luke 15, verse 11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the field to feed pigs. He was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I will perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to them, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and felt compassion. And he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." We're going to pause right there. So the parable's not over, but I want to pause right here because it's really tempting for us to, even as we read through the remainder of the parable, for us to let our imagination stop there. And I want to step through the effort when you compare and contrast this with the lost coin or the lost sheep. Jesus puts a lot of effort into describing the first son and the process that he went through. And if we're a listener, if we're a Moshe and we're going through this, let's step through some of the impacts that Jesus kind of lays up here. The first one being taking care of pigs. So obviously pigs were unclean, but it's even the fact that he was even rearing pigs is like a no-no. We see it in the Mishnah, which is one of the first collection of oral Hebrew traditions, the commandment that none may rear swine anywhere. And then in the Talmud, they add to that like anyone who breeds swine will be cursed. And I've read through this parable many times, and I never even thought about that. I was like, oh yeah, pigs. But it's not just animals, right? There's significance to the fact that these pigs are unclean, and it's something that a Hebrew man would never do. It was commanded to not do. Another kind of just cultural nugget here was this idea that when the father sees him from far off, he runs to embrace him. Respected men in Hebrew society, they didn't run. There's another section in the Mishnah that says something like, respected men shall walk with a slow gait or something, right? But also this idea that like they didn't want to show their legs, right? They didn't want to like in running have their robes come up and show their legs. Like it was just something you didn't do as a respected man. And then another thing, putting on shoes was seen as a slave's job, and he commanded his slaves to go get shoes. And the point here being not that the father put the shoes on, but this idea that putting shoes on another was seen as a symbolism to say, you are my master, right? So the slaves are kind of coming back and putting these shoes onto the son. And that's a sign of respect, saying like, you are back and you are still my master, which is kind of a cool idea. But Jesus goes into all this detail to talk about this prodigal son's self-imposed exile, and I want to step through this and keep in mind the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. Actually, let's pause. Any thoughts about this parable up until now? This self-imposed exile that the son kind of goes through this process and he puts himself in this situation. What comes to mind when we read through that section? Just this first verse, like 11 through 17. Ungrateful. And we got one more.
Or you may be hitting on this later on, but to me it's more about the patience of God.
Patience of God.
Rather than the disobedience of the son, because and it answers the question, will God run? And while we're so far off, God will run to us as long as we're making a forward motion towards him. Yeah,
awesome thought. Yeah, this idea that it's about the patience of God and less about the disobedience of the son. I think it's definitely both, right? It's this cycle. And the patience of God is something we see all throughout the Old Testament, right? With the entire Israelite nation. And at this point, I think Jesus is really kind of showing the pattern and really retelling the story of Israel, right, through these first few verses here. The Israelite nation is this first son, right, has left him, and they've gone into exile, and then they return to him. And we see, I need to catch up with my notes here. We see Israel shaming their father, as we see throughout the prophets, right? One thing I want to point to real quick is Hosea 11, where we kind of see an example of this. Oh, I lost my little notebook. Verse 1 says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with bands of love, and I made them to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent them down and fed them," right? This idea that the disrespect to your father, right? And obviously in Hosea, this is Hosea, and the entire book is about him going and fetching his wife that was a prostitute that God told him to marry, but it's representative of God's relationship with Israel, right? And this idea that we see with the prodigal son, with the lost son, totally disrespecting. Hey, this thing that you're going to give me when you die, I'll take that now, please. Right? Like, I wish you were dead so that I could have this inheritance and go blow it, right? Total disrespect, right? Another theme we see in here is just taking what God has given her as a nation and wasting them. So he gets that thing from his dad. He gets the inheritance. He goes to a Gentile country, and he just blows all the money. Like, just runs through all this money. He's partying, he's doing whatever he's doing, and then he eventually runs out. And we see that in Hosea 2. If you flip over a few pages over there. We see this, right, when we talk about, when Hosea is talking about his wife, right, and all these things that he's given her. I'm gonna read in verse, let's see here. Got to be careful where I'm reading here. In verse 13, just throughout the whole thing, right, I've adorned herself with the ring and jewelry. Earlier on in that section, we see I've put a hedge around her. I've given her all these things to succeed, Hosea's done, right? And yet again, she still runs off to her whoredom and runs after men. Just that disrespect for everything that God has done for the nation doesn't matter. They run off, they make sacrifices to Baal, right? And it's this absolutely, as Bob said, this cyclical nature of God's, of his patience, because he keeps offering solutions and ways for them to come back, but the people keep turning away and doing what they want to do. And then finally, the culmination, right, with the lost son, he becomes a slave, right? He says, there's a famine, I don't have any money, I'm going to go work for this Gentile, and I'm going to bring up pigs, like lowest of the low. So at this moment, the son is really struggling with, he thinks that he is outside the bounds of his father's mercy. So the idea doesn't even come to him of, oh, hey, maybe I can go become a son again. He says, you know what? The things that I've done, I'm not even worthy to be his son. I want to be one of his slaves. And so he goes back and he returns to his father. And what does the father do? He what? He accepts him back. Not just accepts him, but he enthusiastically accepts him, right? With open arms, he runs to him. And Bob mentioned this idea of if we initiate, does God run to us? The Father does here, obviously we see. Which I think really, imagine that you were the Son, right? And you experience this type of mercy, this type of enthusiastic response, this radical gift of your Father running back to you. Do you think you're deserving of this? Probably not. But again, this is a theme that we've seen the Israelites repeat over and over and over. And even, I got it. You got it? All right.
And yet in there with that son, there was a kernel of hope with him too, that his father would take him back, because his father could have turned him away.
Yeah.
So there was in him a little kernel of hope, and I think that kernel of hope's in all of us, that the Father will take us back when we sin too.
Absolutely. That's a great point. There's this little glimmer of hope. Even if it's not as a son, I don't think he's expecting to come back in that capacity, but he knows the love of his father, and he knows the love that his father shares for his slaves, and the fact that they have bread. And so, there's this sliver that keeps him coming back, and that is a great point. And I think that is what the Israelite nation as a whole has seen time and time again. I think it would be hard as an Israelite to know your history, to know the prophets, to read through that, and to not see history repeating itself, but also to not become a little bit entitled to the fact that as a nation, you've seen God accept you back over and over and over. And that's just kind of an aside. It's an interesting thought to me, how you can not see history repeating itself. But absolutely, that little sliver of hope really causes him to take the first step. If we compare this with the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin, at the end of this parable, up until this point where we've stopped, it's extremely similar. The main difference is, obviously, in the sheep and the coin, those two things were not active characters, right, in the parable. They just existed. But in this parable, when Jesus is talking about the lost son, the son is an active character and a participant in the parable in that he put himself in this self-induced exile, right? But at the end of the parable, both the lost sheep and the lost coin, they say, they find the sheep, the shepherd finds the sheep and says, I found my sheep that was lost. And the lost coin, she says, I found my coin that was lost. And she calls her neighbors over to celebrate, right? But what Jesus does, after just telling these two parables about the sheep and the coin, is he adds a new spin on it. And he said, this son of mine that was dead has come back to life. He was lost and has been found. And so what Jesus does here is he's associating death with being lost, and he's associating being found with new life and resurrection. Yeah, Carolyn. Oh. You got it, Lance? Appreciate it. Sorry. I didn't do a good job getting a runner. Carolyn Helly.
I think all these parables, to me, is God is so patient and understanding. He wants all to come to him.
He's so patient and understanding he wants all to come. Yeah, absolutely. This idea of lostness and death and being found and resurrection or new life, does that seem familiar to anyone when we think about the Old Testament and just the story of Israel? What comes to mind? Nothing comes to mind. Let's take a look real quick at Ezekiel chapter 37. What's that? Yep, exactly. Ezekiel 37, verse 11 through 14. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. we are indeed cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord of God, behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel, and you shall know that I am the Lord. When I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people, and I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land, then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares the Lord. So again, yeah, you should have said it. Yeah, so this entire story that Jesus has framed up with the lost son is so paralleled with the entire story of the Israelite nation, all the way to the point where he says, hey, my son was dead. He wasn't dead, he was exiled, and it was an exile that he did to himself. And what's so interesting about this to me is that Jesus, who is Jesus telling this to? Who's Jesus telling this parable to? Who was? Yeah, the Pharisees, the Moshes of the world. As he's telling this parable, I think it lands with its audience in different ways. As he goes through and tells this story and talks about this idea of being lost and equating it to death, I think for almost all of them, they think of exile. They probably think of the Valley of Dry Bones. Maybe they don't. But they still understand that the message that Jesus is saying is that from the Father's perspective, the Son was as good as dead. He came back, he was found, and thus he has been resurrected. I'm trying to figure out how to say this. What's so cool to me about this is as Jesus is telling this parable, he wants everyone in the audience to equate with the younger son. But what's so interesting to me is I think that they do that on a different level. I think the Pharisees hear this and they say, oh yeah, the younger son. Probably at this point, Jesus hasn't said anything too groundbreaking, right, for them. They probably agree, honestly, with most of what he said. They see this pattern. They say, oh yeah, the younger son is exile. The younger son represents the Israelite nation. But then if you're Moshe or a tax collector or a prostitute and you're hearing this, you're thinking, I am that son. I am that self-imposed exile. I've done this. And you know that from a Pharisee's perspective, you're outside the bounds of their idea of forgiveness. And so you're seeing this radical gift that God is providing of running to meet the Son. And if you're a prostitute or a tax collector or a sinner that's not in the inner circle, you're not at the table in the Sabbath meal, that gift takes on a whole new meaning. I want to read real quick Malachi chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4, starting in verse 1. For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all the evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise, with healing in its wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall, and you shall tread down the wicked. For they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says the Lord. So to the Pharisees, right, and this is your idea of the kingdom of heaven coming, is this actionable thing that is, it's immediate and you can recognize it. Is there one more bell, or was that the first one? All right. You can recognize this coming of the kingdom of heaven. We talked about that last week, versus Jesus is starting to kind of intertwine this idea in the parables that you might not recognize it. Might not be as immediate as you thought it was going to be. And so when the Pharisees are going through this and they hear this idea of this gift, they're still thinking about this gift that's going to come, it's going to be immediate. And when Jesus comes with the kingdom of heaven, I'm going to know it's here. Everyone's going to know it's here. And those people that I've determined should be outside of the Sabbath meal, they're outside the bounds of God's forgiveness, they're going to get what's coming to them. But what Jesus is saying is actually those Pharisees, that inner circle in that dinner room, You're the ones that are not at the party. You're invited. You've gone through this exile. You have this relationship with God, but they're choosing not to come to the party. They see Jesus meeting. They see Jesus having these meals with these tax collectors and sinners. They don't go join. Instead, they stand up these walls and they say, no. Those are the people that aren't invited to the party. Those are the people that when God comes and he brings the kingdom of heaven realized now, those are the people that are going to miss the boat. What I think is so interesting about this is, and we talked about Jesus' ability to kind of teach in an ad hoc way, in a very reactionary way. Jesus, as he tells this parable of the lost son, he wants everyone in the crowd to relate with the younger son. But then, and we actually did get through where I wanted to get to, then next week as we look at the second half of this parable, where we look at the older son, not everyone continues through. He wants everyone to say, oh yeah, I am that younger son. I've gone through this exile. I know what this is. But then we see in the older son, he wants the Pharisees to shift gears and realize that they are like the older son. And what's so interesting to note, and we'll get into it next week, is this idea of this banquet, right? This banquet party, and they throw this party for the younger son. When the son comes up, he comes up to the servants and he says, hey, what's going on in there? He won't even go inside. He won't even go to the party. He's invited, but he won't go in. And so the slaves come out and he says, oh, your brother's back. Like, come on. And he won't go. And so then the father comes out and pleads with the older son. Hey, come on, the party's right here. Is that not crazy? He's missed the boat. And that's what Jesus is doing with the Pharisees and saying, hey, I've invited all these people to the party. We're having dinner. It's right here. It's in your midst. You can come. You can walk down the street and be a part of it. But the Pharisees are so hyper-focused on what they think to be the inner circle of forgiveness and that it's only applicable to people who fall within these bounds. But Jesus completely tears that down. And we'll get into that more next week with the older brother as we finish the prodigal son. That's all I had today. We made it. So thank you for your attention. And yeah, we'll pick up there next week.